Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our DICE webinar on preventing tech candidate fraud. My name is Crawford Frazier. I'm a part of the DICE product marketing team, and I'm joined today by Danny Jones, who's on our product team, and he leads our fraud detection efforts, and he'll introduce himself just a bit more shortly. I'm guessing that if you joined today, you are familiar with fake or misrepresented candidate profiles in tech hiring. So it may be a bit of a sore spot for you, but we're pretty excited to talk about ways that we're working to prevent that from happening. But before we get started, just a few administrative items here on the next slide. The first is to please send us questions. Several of you did submit questions when you registered, and we really appreciate that. We're going to save a little bit of time, probably the last 10 minutes or so, for a Q&A session. And we'll start with those questions that were submitted in advance. Second, if you registered, we will send a recording to you of the webinar, so please feel free to share with your colleagues. And finally, we're also going to send you a survey after the webinar. And it's really great to hear back from you. It helps us create valuable content for the future. So we'll move into our agenda today. So we're going to start with the tech hiring challenges. And these are the things that we hear from conversations with employers and recruiters in tech hiring. And we'll talk about how fake and misrepresented profiles interact with that and make those challenges worse. Then I'm going to hand it off to Danny, and he's going to talk about our DICE objectives for preventing database fraud, which will then lead into why are there so many fake profiles in tech hiring? What do those profiles look like? And what is DICE doing to detect them? And that last section will also include some of our results in tech database fraud prevention. And then, as I said, we'll leave the last 10 minutes or so for a Q&A session. So we'll get started now with tech hiring challenges, and you can move on to the next slide, please. So what we hear the most is that tech hiring is really competitive, and that is whether you're a staffing or recruiting firm or you're hiring directly, everyone needs this tech talent, and we believe that need is even higher in this pandemic hiring environment. So that leads to technologists being really unresponsive. So when you're sourcing, we hear that people are not getting enough responses to outreach, sometimes not getting enough applications for their jobs, which makes the next problem even bigger. If you have too many roles to fill at one time, you're really stretched for time, and time is money. So we work with recruiters and employers to figure out how can they be more efficient in these efforts to solve all these problems. So if we move to the next slide, these fake and misrepresented profiles make these problems worse. We're hearing that recruiters are spending about 60% of your time sourcing. So that's a lot of time just finding candidates before you can even screen or interview. And because you have to do so much sourcing, we hear it's about 7 seconds per resume. So moving quickly, trying to find the right skills and titles that are on a resume. And as you're going through them really quickly, that's exactly what the fake and misrepresented profiles are designed for, is to show you these popular skills and titles. So then you're filling your pipeline or your shortlist with candidates who are going to end up wasting time, and you're going to have to repeat a lot of those efforts. So as we move to the next slide, we want to pause just a second and ask, is this an issue that you face? Are you seeing a lot of fake and misrepresented profiles when you're trying to hire tech talent? And we'll pause just a minute to let you answer. All right, we see some answers rolling in, and we are now at 89% say you have faced this problem. So that's a real issue, especially when you're stretched for time. So we can move on to the next slide. And I'm going to turn it over to Danny to then talk about the DICE objectives to solve for this problem.
Thanks, Crawford. Well, hi, everybody. Thanks a lot for joining me today. I'm Danny Jones. I'm the manager of data products here at DHI, and I work with all of the teams that care very, very much about this particular issue. This is a daily grind for me. It's become a labor of love, and I've had the privilege of witnessing the evolution in the technology that's used to help us improve this. And I can say that the people on my team are very passionate about this as well. And although unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of two-way conversation that can happen on this call, know that I would love to talk to any of you that are having these issues, that are looking to get, kind of deeper insight and would love to have a face-to-face conversation. So, at the end of the call, if you have the opportunity to fill out the survey, and note that you would like to have a conversation with me, I will do my best to follow up with you. And again, know that this is something that we're always working on, and really the way that we get better is by continuously listening to folks like yourself. So the mission of my group can be summed up in 3 bullets. So I've got catching fraudulent profiles as quickly as possible and within 1 day of performing what we would call a risky action. We'll talk a little bit about more of that a little bit later. Maintaining less than 5% of fraudulent/recruiter represented profiles in the self-represented database. That's a lot of words, but it will become much simpler here in just a bit. And then ensuring we protect the views and applies of valid US candidates. So those break down into several other areas that we spend a lot of time on. But if we were going to summarize it, I'd say that's probably the best way to summarize how we measure ourselves. Go ahead and go to the next slide. All right, why do fake profiles exist? So I'm going to walk you through a bit of a scenario here that will give you a few things. First, it's going to give you an idea of what some of these fake profiles look like. It's going to show you kind of the process that some folks use to use this to their advantage, and not necessarily a very nice way. And then I'll extend that a bit to talk a little bit about how we help to cover those pieces. And then in the next section, I'll go into how we actually do that. So go ahead and go to the next slide. All right, so what we're going to walk through is basically a scenario that sets up lead generation. And what we found is in the majority of the cases we're dealing with, not all, but in the majority of the cases we're dealing with, the reason this happens is because we've got someone who's trying to generate leads for themselves, whether it's leads on new jobs that are available, trying to inject themselves in a recruiter and a potential candidate so they can be a part of that transaction. And obviously, as the survey just showed, that's a really big problem for you, and it's a big problem for us as well, which is why we spend so much time working on this. So next slide. All right, go ahead and jump in. I think I'm looking for the dummy email addresses. There we go. Go ahead and pop all those out. So I'm showing you a few different email addresses here, but this is a case where if you've had a chance to look at a lot of email addresses, you notice there's something a little bit fishy about these. And in this case, it looks like they're different email addresses, and to a system, they are, except for the fact that Gmail has this little follow through kind of rule where it says if you've got this dot in your name anywhere, it actually ignores the dot and it will send it to the same email address. So in many cases, what we found is, javadeveloper@gmail.com with dots spread all through the email address is usually a good indication that we're dealing with somebody who's trying to game our system. And of course, we have the advantage of looking at the entire population of email addresses that are in our system. So really, really easy for us to spot this. Whereas a recruiter, if you're looking at a profile, it might be a bit more difficult. But when you see like the one below, javadeveloper@gmail.com with a few different dots in there, we've seen it spread out all the way to, in between every single letter, there's a dot. And this is a pretty good indication that you're dealing with somebody who's using that email address for probably a consolidated purpose. So pretend for a second that you found one of these email addresses on a resume that you'd like to contact. It looks great, it's got all the skills that you want. And so you contact that person. Go ahead and go to the next slide. And down below at the bottom of the email, dear candidate, I've reviewed your resume and I'd like to have a conversation with you regarding your experience and availability. So now I've reached out and then I get this response back. Hi, Daniel, hope you're good. Wanted to take this opportunity to introduce myself as a business development manager at Recruiters R Us. Well, clearly that's not the candidate that I was intending to talk to. So this is what we're calling a bait and switch case. And this is really what that injection looks like when someone's trying to do lead generation. Now, there's many, many different ways that this happens, but this is a pretty common way, and it's worth calling out, and probably one that you've experienced on your own. So, as a recruiter, I look at this and I'm furious. I've spent so much time sourcing for this position and I'm getting nothing but emails like this left and right. There has to be a way that we can find these folks and we can get them out of our system. So how do we do that? Go to the next slide. So, from my standpoint, we spend a lot of time looking at associations. So, for example, that resume that we just looked at, that was submitted by a device. It's got specific email addresses. It may be from a sanctioned country. There's dozens and dozens of different signals that we look at on our side, and we have a really interesting sort of holistic view of this data, right? So we can actually see it in a network view versus the view you may have where you're just looking at one individual resume, which can be really, really hard to spot if you don't know exactly what you're looking for. So using AI, machine learning, and some different technologies that we've invented internally, we have a really good system where we can start to look at some of these things. So I can look at those things, I can start to pull that together, and I can make some decisions that will essentially help to clean the pool so that you don't have to make those decisions. Next slide. Now, in the case of what we just talked about, this is an example of a resume, right? Now we pointed one obvious thing out, right? Like if it said fraud@gmail.com, it would be fantastic if they all said that, right? It'd be super easy and be like, nah, I don't want the one that says fraud@gmail.com. Thanks, I'll pass. But unfortunately, that's not really the way these things work, right? So Java developer@gmail.com is what you end up seeing here. And of course, we know that that's fraudulent. So we're able to take actions on it. But if you go and you look at the rest of this profile, everything looks pretty legit. It's sometimes really hard to spot what's fake and what's not. But like I said, I've got many, many different signals that I can use to look at this. And when I look at it, I can pull out certain signals that say, okay, this person, maybe there's nothing bad on this resume, but they're associated with someone that is, right? And I can use that network effect to generate a risk score. And if that risk is high enough, then we won't let the profile in, and that's generated automatically. So I'll talk a little bit more about how that works in just a bit, but this kind of gives you an idea of, if I hadn't pointed out fraud@gmail.com, is there anything on here that you would have spotted as being fake or stolen? Maybe not, right? Other than John Smith is a very common name, but that's the point. It's a very common name. So sure, it kind of looks fakey, but it may not be, right? There's a real John Smith out there that is an IT project manager, and how do you know the difference? So that's where our systems come into play. Next slide. So we've talked about the bait and switch case up to this point, and that's not the only way that some of these fraudulent profiles are using systems, right? So one of the other areas is apply spam. So let's say that a fraudulent profile is created and they're not even searchable in the database, but they're sending applications from that newly created profile. Well, applications, that apply event, that's something that we care about a lot. And of course, again, using AI and machine learning, we can kind of tell the difference between what a human can do and what a machine can do. So we look very, very closely at apply spam. If we start seeing these numbers go through the roof, if we start getting feedback from other clients that there's an issue here, then we can take immediate action and we can start to block these things. So I talk about these things, almost with a sense of permanence, like they've always been here, but that's just not the truth. The truth is, over the last couple of years, a lot of this technology has emerged, and we've really been at the forefront of working with different companies to figure out what solutions are possible, creating solutions internally that we know that we can use that are catered specifically to how tech candidates behave. And that's one of the real neat things about our system is we specialize in tech candidates, right? So when you're dealing with a generalist system, some of our competitors, understanding those signals, sure, some of them will overlap, but they don't necessarily have the time invested in that one segment like we do. So we've found a lot of early success just because we had that expertise in-house. And again, it's not perfect, but over the last couple of years, I've seen this evolve in a very tremendous way. And it's been just really neat to see what we can do now versus what we could do even a year ago. So next slide. All right, so now let's dig into the details a bit. How do we actually go about doing this? Go ahead and jump in. First thing is we had to step back and really look at, what are the principles, right? So I showed you some of the measurements early on, and I was kind of using that as a spoiler, right? Just to say, hey, we do have a framework here, but this is about, 2 or 3 levels higher than that. So when we really looked at approaching this, we had to say, okay, what is it that we want to learn from these systems? The first is, we want to know that you are who you say you are. So being able to validate, being able to verify, there are technologies in place now that allow us to do a lot more of that than we could in the past. So once we figure out you are who you say you are, now there's the problem of, well, did you say what's on your resume is true, right? Are you the paper tiger that went through and filled out the resume with a bunch of things that aren't true? This is an area that we're getting better and better at. But the first one, we feel fairly confident that we've got a pretty good platform that allows us to address that. So what you say about yourself is true, and then your actions build trust is the third one. So depending upon how you behave and depending upon all of the interactions and the network signals that we look at, these are the 3 things that we really want to promote in terms of creating a good community of both candidates as well as clients. And ultimately, our goal is to say, hey, everybody who plays ball in this system plays by the rules. And we know that's not always the case, but I've got some good numbers coming up to show you what kind of progress we've made in that regard. So next slide. All right. So once we identified those principles, then we broke it down into themes, and we said, how do we segment this? Where do we spend our time? So the first thing was, it started with people. We had to evaluate, who are the different segments of populations that are using our systems, and are there higher risk segments? And we were able to break that down and define a strategy based on certain segments where we were seeing more activity. So we said, okay, these are the areas where we see more risk. These are the areas where we see less risk. Now that we've identified those risky groups, now we look at the signals, and this comes back to the dozens and dozens of signals that we look at. Again, when I say dozens and dozens of signals, that's not something that a human can easily process. So this is where AI and machine learning really came in. We had to use these massive systems to collect data and to essentially aggregate it to a point where we could do something with it. And in addition to that, the decisions portion, this is where we've always had a compliance team who was looking at this. So we had to learn, how do we marry these signals with these manual decisions and come up with potentially a risk score? And so that last portion is connections, and that's really what comes from an AI or a machine learning system, is based on behaviors, patterns, signals, what we're learning. We can generate a risk score for an individual profile. Now, the neat part about having a human involved there is, I use the example sometimes of, you've got one of these automated stoplights, right, where like the light turns red and then it takes a picture of everybody who's crossing through. Well, what it doesn't take into account is the context of like, well, hey, the guy in front of me stepped on his brakes. So, I was caught in the middle and I didn't really have a choice. So that's where, you kind of need that context and that human side of it. So we marry up those manual decisions with these automated signals, and in between we meet and we come up with this sort of supervised, trained algorithm that allows us to generate this risk score. And just in initial testing, we were really worried about, well, is this going to be as good as a human, or is it just going to be more of a pain than anything else? And it does what it says it does. It learns over time. And so we're to the point now with this where our error rate with that algorithm is roughly the same as a human, and in some cases better, right? Especially if that human doesn't have the training necessary to make a really detailed decision. So as our as our labor force comes up to speed, we actually have an algorithm that performs better than newer compliance people, and that's really cool, because we've got our senior people in there that are teaching new folks how to use the system, just like they're teaching these algorithms how to use the system, and it comes together in a really neat solution that's been very effective. Next slide. Okay. What behaviors require detection? So this is just a few of them. And again, we've got quite an array of things that we look at here, but these are the obvious ones, right? So when a user registers on the platform, okay, obviously something new, right? If it's new, we got to check it. When a user creates or updates a profile, So you've been here for a while, but all of a sudden you made a profile update 5 years after you created the profile. Either you're looking for a job, which is fine, or is there something more going on? Has someone potentially taken over your account? Things like that. We're very well aware of the possibility of that, and we've obviously got systems that look specifically for those types of things. User applies for a job, totally normal behavior and an expected behavior, but also a potential point where new data can be introduced and fraud can happen. And then a user sets the profile to visible. Assuming you're all familiar with DICE, I'm going to assume that the majority of you know what that means, but in case you're not, what that means is when a user initially creates their profile, they're the only ones that can see it. They can use it to apply, but nobody else can see it in Talent Search. So if they set themselves visible, that means that they want other people to look at their profile. And for us, that's also a red flag, right? If you're a new record going into Talent Search, that's something that we want to look at. So these are just a few of the examples, but like I said, they're pretty much the major ones. Next slide. All right, so we've done a lot of talking about fraud up to this point and how we look at specific profiles, but we found in this journey that there was an equally large problem when you're dealing with large data sets, and it's a little bit more foundational than fraud itself. So this is good old-fashioned data quality or master data management. Our algorithms are only as good as the data that we push in. So if we're filling it with a bunch of junk, we're not learning what we need to learn on that side. So what we attempt to do first is by going through a process where we're using data quality dimensions, we essentially master the data to the point where we feel like, okay, this is the best that record can be, right? And if it's not meeting our expectations, we don't even let it in the system. So that way we're trying to reduce the amount of garbage that goes into the system. So where we spend our time and money evaluating profiles is best spent on those things that are potentially real or potentially fraud. So, even though this one's a little bit off topic in my mind, it's still really crucial, especially if you're here today because you're trying to understand how to do some of this on your own. Start with the quality of your own data. Make sure that you understand where your risks are. If you've got incomplete data, if there's inconsistencies there, if your data is old, if you've got a bunch of invalid phone numbers, I mean, that leads to essentially the same kind of experience that a fraudulent profile does. Phone number is malformed, or so you're guessing as to what the phone number is. I mean, it makes the record unusable. So why even bring that into your system in the first place? So you kind of take this to sweep and say, we're comfortable with the quality of data entering our system. Now we're going to spend our time and money making sure that these are folks that meet those three principles above. Next slide. All right, so once we scrub that and we bring it into the system, this is the strategy that we look at in terms of how we effectively work with fraud. So right up at the top, automated banned source enforcement. So if we have very set and specific rules where we just know we're just not going to allow this, and this can be code of conduct, it can be in terms of service abuse, those types of things. We don't need to really evaluate that any further. And the majority of the profiles we catch are actually in this area. So, fortunately for us, that's a very cheap way to find this stuff. So right up at the top, things get banned based on just, low-level rule violations. So plain and simple there. Then we move on to where things get a little bit more interesting. This is the behavior-driven risk score. And this is where, although there's definitely some data science in the top portion, the machine learning and the AI portion really starts to take place here in the behavior-driven risk score. This is where we pull in signals, not just from DICE, but from outside of our community as well. And we're able to get really this really large, almost kind of industry level network of signals that help us determine this. And this has been a game changer for us. Now, next in line is the manual review. We talked about that with compliance. And of course, compliance is forever, helping to continuously train our behavior-driven risk score. And then that last piece is an audit. Now, the reason this part's important is because, sometimes you can convince yourself that you're doing a great job, but you're not seeing the big picture, right? And so this is something we're very cautious of. We actually hire an external company and we send them a very, very large sample of data that we are convinced is good data. convinced, it's gone through all of the systems, risk scores applied, and then we want them to evaluate from their external opinion to say, do you agree? Is this 100% accurate? And it's not. It's not always, and we learn a lot from that process. Fortunately, we've been getting very, very consistent in how often we measure this, so we've been able to apply a lot of that feedback. But again, if you're here to try and understand how you do this on your own, I can't tell you how valuable this step is, right? Having a third party come in and actually do their due diligence, an unbiased third party to tell you, hey, I don't care if it hurts your feelings or not, this data is bad. You need to hear that, and we needed to hear that, and that's why this has been so effective for us. Next slide. All right. And Crawford, is this where you take over again?
I think you can still handle it, Danny, and I'll come back in for the product portion at the very end.
All right. Next one. All right. So this is that number I've been promising you. When we send our data to an external third party, they sent a result back saying that 97% of the DICE profiles we sent were legitimate tech candidates. And there are a few things they did. They look at, they actually call them on the phone. They go and they scan the resumes themselves. And these are not systems, these are people, right? So a small army of people comes in and looks at this and actually goes to validate these things. And it's not a small set of data either. So the fact that we were able to achieve 97%, and we've done this more than 2 quarters now, and the last one was actually a little bit higher than that, but it averages down to 97%. It's been huge for us because it allowed us to say, okay, well, what was the 3%? How did we miss that part? What do we need to do to get even better? Because even 3% is too many. So, but again, this was a huge accomplishment for us. Had we done this same measurement, a couple of years back, it definitely would not have been this good. We knew that, which is why we spent so much time and effort to really improve this side of the business. Next slide.
Yep, thanks, Danny. So we're going to talk a little bit about what this means if you're working with DICE. So the quality of our database really runs through all of the solutions that we offer our clients. But the two that you're probably most familiar with are sourcing for tech talent and posting jobs to attract tech talent. So our sourcing platform is called TALENTSEARCH. Many of you may know that already. And Danny mentioned earlier visible profiles. So we have more than 2.7 million visible profiles in TALENTSEARCH. And given that stat he just shared, that means you can feel confident that of those visible profiles, more than 97% of them are confirmed real technologists. So when you have that kind of confidence, you can move ahead quickly with the real business of sourcing. You can still perform a Boolean search in TALENTSEARCH, but we also can make that easier for you with our IntelliSearch feature. So you could paste an entire job description or a resume of the kind of candidate that you want to find into IntelliSearch, and we'll return candidates that meet that job description or that match that resume. Out of those candidates, you can also determine which ones are looking for new opportunities right now. We have a likely to switch feature that focuses on some recent behaviors by those candidates. So maybe they just performed a job search in the last 30 days. And finally, another feature in TALENTSEARCH is our synonym matching. So we can also uncover skills and titles that are related to what you're looking for. So we can increase that pool of talent as you source. So we can jump to the next slide. And the other way this is really important initiative is for posting jobs on DICE. We've invested a lot over the last 18 months in making the workflow for posting and managing and tracking applicants much easier. But this 97% confidence in our database also means that those applicants to your jobs are confirmed and you can feel confident in who they are. And so then you can get into the real business of tracking them, sharing them with colleagues, or prioritizing the applicants by their DICE match score, how strongly they match your job description, which means you can move from posting your job to interviewing much faster than you normally could. So now we're going to pause here and get into the real issues that you guys identified in the questions that you asked. So please continue to submit. We're going to be respectful of everyone's time and not keep you here too long. But if you do submit and we don't have a chance to get to it, we can follow up with you. I'm going to start by asking Danny a list of questions that we received during the registration process. So Danny, the first one is, if we uncover fraudulent candidate profiles, what do we do? Do we report them to DICE? And if so, how do we do that?
Very, very good question. Again, assuming you guys are all using the DICE products, there are two ways that you can do that. First is if you're using the talent search interface, then there's actually a flag where you can report the candidates. In the top right-hand corner, I want to say there's a three dots that you click and then a drop-down list where it's got a flag that you can report them. If you're using an ATS or an automated system, we actually have a public API that allows you to do this as well. So if you're not aware of that piece, I would definitely reach out to your ATS to make sure that they're aware of it. And if you're not using an ATS and you're working directly with the API, then it's out there today. You can go and see the docs and you can start using it immediately.
All right, next question is, can we find the fake profiles by just seeing their resumes?
I wish that were the case in most of them. And I'm going to say some cases you can, right? Like you can look at it and you can totally see. But for the most part, unless you're really, really good at kind of knowing what signals to look for, it can be really difficult to do. The Gmail address one that I mentioned, that one's pretty common, but a lot of these things you can't always see right up front, right? You have to look at them in against the population of resumes. Now, there are some visual cues that you can probably see, right? The more you look at candidate data, you start to see some similarities between formatting, table usage, certain fonts, things like that. So, our compliance team could obviously sit down and look at one of these things and, for the most part, spot them pretty often. But even they need the help of these systems to really be able to look at them on a whole to really know. So it's a really difficult problem to solve. And I definitely feel for you if you're trying to spot that in isolation on your own. That can be a really big challenge. Again, reach out to me. I'm happy to talk about any of those things, but DICE has the infrastructure and the systems in place to help with those pieces.
Okay, next question. How prevalent is candidate fraud, and is it surging above historical numbers?
That's an excellent question. I will say prior to COVID, I was seeing a big surge. When COVID hit, we saw it flatten quite a bit, which is to be expected because lots of people were out of work, and the industry had not quite caught up yet with how they were going to respond. And with the market coming back, we're seeing fraudulent attempts come back as well. Unfortunately, we're much better prepared to deal with them now than we were, in the past. So while that surge is coming back, that from your perspective, you shouldn't be experiencing that through our systems. There's always been, some that kind of slip through and things like that, and we're getting better at catching those. But we're the reason I know that the surge is coming back is because we're catching more. So, and that's obviously motivation for us to stay on our toes as well, because as bad actors continue to evolve, so must we, and we do. So I will say that even though I can't give you a specific percentage, it's a continued threat, and it's coming back as the market comes back after COVID.
Okay, next one. Is there a particular discipline in IT that you see more cases of candidate fraud?
That is a great question. There are themes, right? And it depends on what's popular in the market, right? So, software developers, obviously, that's a key one. And really, you can predict it by, looking at some of the things like, Bureau of Labor Statistics, right? And CompTIA, and their predictions in terms of what jobs are entering the market. They follow those trends, right? As jobs emerge, then the fraud follows those things, right? Because again, it's about lead generation. So when you're starting to see a Java developers a serious need for that, then you're going to see more cases in that area. So I wish I could give you a specific pinpoint, but I can at least give you somewhat of a compass, which is to say, if you're watching the industry trends and you're recruiting in those specific areas, which likely you are, then you can expect that the more popular those positions are, the more opportunity there is in those areas, the more fraud you're going to see.
Okay, next question that was submitted in advance is there a way to see this when you're reviewing hundreds of resumes at a time?
There is for me. I can see it through our risk score. I can see it through our automation systems. So for me, there is, because I have the infrastructure in place to do it. It may be very, very difficult if you're on the receiving end, if you don't have those same tools to be able to spot those things. And I would very much caution against low-level tactics, like if you're trying to scan by IP address, take a little time to understand what a VPN is, a virtual private network. Understand that IP addresses change. Don't make the mistake of blocking an IP address that blocks out the entire state of New York, right? Like, yeah, it's if you're just looking for low signals like that, you could find yourself blocking more than you need to and cutting too close to the bone, which is why we have so many different signals, because we have to balance those things out.
All right, thanks. And I see some questions have come in during the webinar. Does this oversight apply to clearance jobs as well?
It is primarily for DICE at this time.
All right, thanks. Another one that's come in is there a way to filter out candidates who are not looking for a full-time position? Many times candidates will check they're looking for full-time, they come up in a full-time search, but then when called, they're only looking for a contract.
Interesting. I would reach out to your sales rep to walk through some of the talent search features. They have many, many different options, and even some that have just come out recently that really help you to fine tune that. And obviously, if you're familiar with Boolean searches, there's some different ways that you can approach that. IntelliSearch is actually really, really good at helping you discover some of those non-obvious things. So while I don't have a direct answer for you, because that's not my product in the area where I spend most of my time focusing, I can tell you that there is a group that does spend all of their time focusing on that, and they can certainly help you with those types of things.
All right, thanks. Another one came in that I can answer. Do we need to subscribe to DICE to use Talent Search, or can we just subscribe to Talent Search? And the answer to that is we can work with you for what you need. If you want to just source through Talent Search, that's a contract we can work with you on. If you want to post jobs exclusively, you can do that. If you want access to both, we can help you with that. And we also have some services such as sourcing services where we can find the candidates on your behalf. So it really depends on what kind of needs you have. And I think those are the only ones we can get to today. I do see a few more have come in that we can answer separately and follow up with you, but do want to be respectful of everyone's time. We really appreciate you attending today. Again, we will email you a recording of this presentation, so feel free to share it. We'll also email you a survey to follow up, and we'd love your feedback because it helps us present more valuable content in the future for you. So thanks again. Hope everyone has a great day.
Thanks, everyone.